Hello and welcome to another episode of the TorchCast. I'm Dwayne Lester, editor of the Missouri Torch. Today we're going to talk with Dr. James Shuls, a fellow at the Show Me Institute, about the history of charter schools in Missouri, what they're doing right now, and what we can expect from them possibly in the future. Dr. Shuls, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
What I'd like to do is start at when charter schools initially began in Missouri, and let's bring it up to where we're at right now.
Yeah, so the first charter law in Missouri was passed in 1998, and then the first charter schools started opening just the following couple of years after that. They were initially restricted to just St. Louis and Kansas City. They weren't allowed to open anywhere else in the state. And that's partly why we still see the geographic restrictions to St. Louis and Kansas City. That's the only place we currently have charter schools. A couple of years ago, they lifted the cap or lifted the restriction and said they can open in any unaccredited school district, but none have done that thus far. There are various reasons which we might discuss on why they haven't. But right now we have about 51 charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City combined, enrolling about 20,000 students. And if you put it in terms of the sector or the market share, in Kansas City, about 40% of all public school students are now in charter schools, and in St. Louis, it's close to 30%. So we've really come a long way since about 2000, where we had no one in charter schools, to now having really significant market shares in both St. Louis and Kansas City.
So how are the students doing in these schools? I've seen some news reports that charter schools have failed.
Well, there are charter schools that fail, and that's actually the beauty of the charter market, is that it allows schools that aren't doing well to close. We've had our share of those in Missouri. Just a few years ago, we had the Imagine charter schools that all closed, and many pointed to that as a failure of the charter school market, but it's really one of the successes. There was a study that came out just a couple of years ago from Credo, and I forgot what that acronym stands for, but they're out of Stanford University, and they looked at a nationwide study of charter schools where they compared students in the charter schools to a matched group of students who remained behind in the traditional public schools. And what they found is that in Missouri, the charter schools were significantly outperforming the public schools. And so again, the comparison is St. Louis and Kansas City school districts. So they're significantly outperforming them in terms of learning gains in both math and language arts. And part of the reason that the charter schools seem to be improving more and more over time, as the study identified, was that the bad schools are closing. Whereas in the traditional public schools, the bad schools just sort of exist always, unless the enrollment declines forever and ever. And you see, like in Kansas City a few years ago, where they closed 30 schools all at once. What we see in the charter sector is this is what the model is. It's built on continuous improvement, where new schools open, bad schools close, more schools open, more schools close. That's what's supposed to happen. We're not seeing as many close as we are open in Missouri, but that's generally what the model is supposed to do.
So how could a charter school, when you look at it in terms of schools across the state that are non-accredited, how could charter schools be used in those situations?
Well, so right now we have a handful of unaccredited school districts, and the most notable or most recognized ones right now are in the St. Louis area. We have Normandy and Riverview Gardens. So these two schools where the dropout rates are approaching 50%, not quite that high, but half the kids don't make it to graduation. Average ACT scores are really low. Students are just really underperforming these districts. And the reason people know the names of these two districts is that they've been in the news a lot over the past year because of the transfer program, which says students in unaccredited school districts can transfer to nearby accredited school districts. And so we saw them go from these two districts to about 20 different St. Louis area school districts. Well, so there are two ways that charter schools could help. So a charter school could open in these unaccredited districts and allow the students to have another option within their community. So in St. Louis and Kansas City, they have magnet schools, which are district-run schools that are schools of choice, and they have charter schools. In the unaccredited school districts in other parts of the state, they have neither of those things, and so they have no choice. And so we saw, as soon as they allowed these students to transfer, about a quarter of the students left. Overnight, they went from having 100% of the students to having 75% of the students, and it really caused quite a shock for them. But if we had charter schools in the area, we wouldn't have to bus students out other places. They could stay within their local school district and attend school there. So that's the key thing, is allowing them to have options close to home. But the reason, I touched on this a minute ago, the reason that charter schools might not want to open in these districts is because they're relatively small. Normandy-Riverview Gardens have about 4,000 students roughly. We compare that to St. Louis and Kansas City, which are still among the largest districts in the state with 15, 20,000 students. It's really difficult for a charter to try to open in such a small district where they're only able to take students from within that district. And so, charter schools are hesitant to open there because they might not have enough students to sustain themselves, just because of the simple size of the local school body. And so if we allowed charter schools to enroll students across district boundaries, which we don't currently allow, we'd have we'd have a much higher probability of a charter school opening in these areas.
Well, let me ask you this. Maybe it's something we should have covered at the beginning, but explain exactly what a charter school is, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about what a charter school is. It's actually a public school, but how is it funded differently, and what makes it different than a public school? Yeah,
you're right. Charter schools are public schools. They're funded by tax dollars, local tax dollars, and state tax dollars. They're funded a little bit less. They don't get transportation funding, and they don't get facilities funding, but they're public schools. They're just public schools of choice, where instead of being assigned to go there, you get to choose to go there. And if they don't attract enough students to go to these schools, they close. Another key difference between the two is that the district, is run by the local school district board, whereas the charter schools are run sort of independently. And each of the different charter schools throughout the state might have an independent board, and they're run independent. They're more autonomous. They have more ability they're more flexible, have ability to innovate, do all kinds of creative things. But they trade this sort of autonomy for accountability. The accountability comes from parents being able to choose, and it comes from their sponsors, which are universities. So they're held accountable in all kinds of different levels. They take the same state tests. They are required to meet all the rules and requirements in terms of not discriminating against students. But the real difference is people can choose to go to these schools rather than be assigned to them.
So in Missouri, there's actually bipartisan support for this. Mayor Slay in St. Louis is a huge supporter. So what's keeping them from expanding more? What's generally the opposition to them?
Yeah, I mean, the initial bill was passed through bipartisan support. Throughout the country, charter schools generally receive bipartisan support. The real opposition to charter schools in Missouri comes from education groups, the teachers associations, the administrators associations, the unions, all those groups, and generally outstate Republicans. The more rural places tend to oppose charter schools, I think primarily because they don't see any benefit from it. They think, oh, this is a city solution to a city problem, and it's not for us. And they don't see that there are really upsides, even for rural parents and students, for charter schools. And so the opposition isn't really along party lines so much as it is sort of ideological lines. Those who believe in markets and choice and competition, and those who believe that those things have no place in education.
Well, it's interesting to me that you say that it's usually the rural Republicans, because we've talked about before the fact that the most powerful lobby in Jefferson City is the education lobby, and we've said before too that often the superintendent of a school is the most powerful political voice in a representative's district, or possibly even a senator's district. But what I find confusing is the opposition to charter schools from these rural education groups, when you said earlier that charter schools, couldn't even develop maybe in Normandy where there's 4,000 students. So what's the threat to rural schools?
Well, they don't see the benefits, really. I mean, I don't know if there is much threat, but there's no upside. And so the lawmakers they see no positive, they see no benefit, and all they hear is negative. And so they're receiving pressure from their local superintendents and also their school boards. And remember, local school boards are the largest body of elected officials in our state. We have more school board members than any other elected official. And the school boards associations are also opposed to school choice in charter schools. So it's not, just about every education group is opposed to this. And so you're an elected official from some rural town. You have no one clamoring for charter schools, but you have all of your education groups fighting against it. There's no upside. There's no positive for those officials. And I think that's really why they tend to not support these types of reforms.
It's stunning to me that they couldn't just go back and say, this isn't really a threat to you. This is only going to impact the urban areas, the cities, and here in Northwest Missouri or in Ottaway County, this isn't going to impact us. So I'm going to go ahead and vote for it and explain to it. But something else that blew my mind that you just said is that there are more elected. The state school boards are the most, the largest elected bodies in the state. When you think about that, it helps you understand why some of these rural, elected people, representatives and senators, oppose things like tax cuts, because all they're hearing then are from the school boards and the superintendents who are saying, this is going to hurt our schools. It's fascinating the way that all these things tie together. But right now, when you look at charter schools in the state, is it something that's growing? Is it a movement that's growing, or is it something that's sort of stagnant or maybe even dying out?
No, it's absolutely growing. I mean, we've seen the enrollment in charter schools continually growing in St. Louis and Kansas City. And as I said, the market share in both these cities is growing. And there's more and more push to get charter schools into other places, to allow students and parents who want to start charter schools to open them in other places. So this is I think, like a snowball. A snowball started rolling down the hill, and it's picking up steam as it goes along. And every now and again, it hits a bump along the way. But charter schools are here to stay, and I think that they're just going to continue to grow both in the cities and statewide. Part of that, though, is we're going to need some legislative changes. For charter schools to really be vibrant, we need charter schools to have some sort of open enrollment where they can enroll students across district boundaries. We need to remove some of the restrictions and allow them to be open, not just in unaccredited school districts, but everywhere. Because charter schools are not about serving students in schools that are failing. Charter schools are about providing options. And everyone wants options. Even in good school districts, parents deserve to have some options. And if the charter school doesn't provide a good alternative option, it's not going to stay open. And so that's what we need. We need to remove some of the barriers and allow them to expand in more places. And I think that's going to happen over time.
One thing that as a homeschool dad, I've taken some flack from members of the school board in my area is because they say that because our child doesn't go to their school, they're losing out on state dollars. One thing that I've noticed is that charter school students take less money to educate than, say, a public school student. So explain how that works, explain how the money works in that, and where does the savings go for a charter school student? Where does that extra money get spent?
Yeah, a recent study on this from the University of Arkansas found that Missouri charter schools are getting about $4,000 less on average than the traditional public schools. So they're getting less money, and really where that comes from is they're not getting the transportation money, they're not getting facilities money. So when we talk a lot about schools, we often talk about per pupil expenditures. And the per pupil expenditures the number we typically throw around is for operating expenses, paying teacher salaries, buying textbooks, those types of things. So the charter schools have to pay for their buildings, their facilities, any transportation that they want to offer out of that fund of money. And so the beneficiary is that the traditional public schools, they lose the per pupil expenditures that go with the students to the charter school, but they keep all the facilities money. And so, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily benefiting at the hand of charter schools, but they are not paying the charter schools for facilities. And charter schools are getting as good of results, if not better, with less money.
What I found interesting was I took a trip to D.C. just recently to look at some of the different school choice options they have there, toured some of the schools there. And some of the schools there were in buildings that were not modern. They were not, something that you look at and say, oh, that's a nice school. Some of the schools that you couldn't even open or close the windows, they were just old. And you're talking about not getting facilities money. Often you hear from public school administrators that they need a new building or a new facility or a new this or new that, or they need money for upkeep. And a lot of charter schools are getting as good or better results in facilities that many would consider run down. Is that true in Missouri as well?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, one of the best schools in the St. Louis area is a KIPP school. KIPP stands for the Knowledge is Power program, and it's in this an old, it was abandoned religious, a private school that was just an old sort of rundown building, and they were able to step in. But think about this, okay, in St. Louis and Kansas City, both cities have between 20 and 30 abandoned school buildings, vacant school buildings sitting open, okay, not doing anything with them. And we have, a number of charter schools in both cities, and I bet you could count probably on one hand the number that are in old St. Louis or Kansas City public school buildings. They're buying old church buildings or renting old church buildings. They're getting in anywhere they can because historically the districts have not wanted to sell to them. In recent years, they've changed those policies a little bit, but we have vacant school buildings in both cities, and we have charter schools opening in old rundown, formerly private schools or strip malls or wherever because they can't get access to the facilities. And so they're not getting facilities funding, they're not getting access to the facilities, they're opening in these random places, as you mentioned, and yet doing very well, which suggests that, education's not about the amount of money we're spending, and it's not about the bells and whistles of the school building. It's really about what the teachers and the staff are doing in those school buildings and the interactions they're having with kids. And charter schools seem to be doing those things very well.
Now, also on the money aspect, while we're just right in that general area, how is the pay between a public school and a charter school? First, start with the teachers and then the administrators, and then if you could talk about the size of the administration staff between the two also.
Yeah, so it varies. We don't really have I haven't seen a good document that says how much the average teacher salary is at all the charter schools. But typically, they tend to make slightly more than the traditional public school teachers. Oftentimes, they're required to work more hours, though. The KIPP school that I mentioned earlier has a longer school day, longer school year, often has Saturday school where teachers are coming in. So they're making more money, but the district the school is asking more of them. So their teachers are doing all right. Again, even with less funding and paying for the facilities out of the funding, they're paying their teachers on average more. I'm not positive on the administrators on how much they're making, but they have smaller central offices. So you think about the large urban districts, they have these big central office buildings with lots of people in them doing all kinds of jobs. If you're a superintendent, you're assistant superintendents of 10 different subjects. Charter schools tend to be leaner at the top and allow the local schools to make more decisions and have more discretion over their budget. So we do have some charters that are sort of networks where they have multiple schools, but many of them are independent schools where the school leader and maybe what you might call a superintendent is over the school, but they have few other administrators. And so we see these systems are able to run much more efficiently because they have to. They don't have the luxury of having administrative bloat like we've seen over the years in the public school districts.
Well, I think I've learned a lot just from our conversation, but the one thing that I think that I want everyone to take away from this is if you are in support of a charter school, even if you're in a rural district, it's important that you reach out to your representatives and let them know that, because a lot of times all they're hearing from are school administrators who are against this just because they see no benefit for them when it could benefit, Missouri as a whole very, greatly.
Yeah, if I could just share a quick story. So a few years back, I was teaching in the Republic School District, which is near Springfield, Missouri. And there was a piece of legislation that was sort of a school choice reform. And I sent an email to my lawmaker, my state rep, and said, hey, I'm a teacher in your area. I support this legislation. And he responded to me and said, James, thank you for sending that email. I agree with you, but you're the only one that has sent me a message in favor of this bill. I received hundreds opposed to it from other teachers and school officials. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We have the education groups are very organized, and they're very willing to contact their lawmakers whenever they oppose a piece of legislation. They're easy to mobilize. And it's rare to have people contacting lawmakers in favor of these reforms. And so, yeah, if you support school choice, if you support giving parents options of not being forced to send their child to a school, but being able to choose the school of their choice, then you should let your lawmakers know.
I know that in Missouri, the homeschool groups are very well organized. Clearly, the public school groups are well organized. Is there a central group in Missouri that is very much pro-school choice? I mean, I'm not talking about somebody like the Show Me Institute, but just a group of parents that are pro-school choice.
Right. Well, I mean, oftentimes it's very fragmented. You have the Missouri Charter Public School Association, which represents charter schools. And so you have the group of people that are in charter schools and support choice through charter schools. Then you have people in private schools who support private school choice, and some of them support private school choice programs. And then you have homeschoolers who support homeschooling, but maybe not support the others. And so there doesn't seem to be a group that's organizing all of them and saying, what's the key principle across all these things? It's not that charter schools are best, or that private schools are best, or that homeschooling is best, but it's that choice is best, and having options is best. So how do we create a system where people are able to choose the best choice for their kid, whether that's the charter, the private, the homeschooling, or even a traditional public school? So there really isn't a group that's doing a very good job of organizing all the people. It's been very fragmented, and I think that's partly why Missouri's sort of late to the game in some of these things. I mean, we haven't talked about private school choice, but states throughout the country are pushing and passing private school choice legislation, and Missouri's not even talking about it. And so we're talking about it, but just not very seriously. So I think part of that is because the groups that support school choice have been fractious or not been rallied together and joined together. And I think that's what needs to happen if we want to really have a robust school choice system, is that these different groups need to rise above supporting their one type of school system and recognize that we need a broad school choice system that allows everyone to make the choice that's going to best meet the needs of their kids.
Yeah, I agree. It is really about choice. But when you look at the charter school system, it's something that to me it's a no-brainer. It costs less. It's just as effective or more effective. And they're doing things in schools that have been rejected by the public school itself. So I appreciate the time you spent just giving us kind of an overview, a history of it, and what we can look for in the future. Dr. James Shuls, a fellow at the Show Me Institute, thank you for your time.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
This has been yet another edition of the TorchCast. I'm Dwayne Lester, editor of the Missouri Torch. As always, it is my pleasure. Until next time, take care and God bless. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more of them in the future, please consider making a donation to the Missouri Torch here. And please subscribe to our new YouTube channel and visit us at themissouritorch.com.